January 1936. A cold wind sweeps across the grass at Eastleigh Aerodrome as a new prototype, sleek, almost predatory, rolls onto the field. Its nose gleams in the pale English sun. Its fuselage looks impossibly smooth, but it's the wings that stop every engineer, mechanic, and visiting officer in their tracks. They're thin, almost delicate, and they curve outward in an elegant ellipse that seems to defy every conventional idea of what a fighter aircraft should look like. One RAF officer mutters, "It'll never hold up in combat, far too fragile." Another laughs, "Beautiful, yes. Practical? Hardly." But one man, standing quietly with hands in pockets, knows exactly what he's created. His name is Reginald Joseph Mitchell, and his unorthodox wing design is about to change the course of aviation history and save Britain in its darkest hour. This is the story of how a shape, an elegant elliptical curve, gave birth to the most maneuverable fighter of the early war. A wing so thin, so aerodynamically perfect, that it let the Spitfire dance through the sky while enemy pilots struggled just to keep it in their sights. A wing that critics mocked, that bureaucrats resisted, and that some engineers swore would never work, until it did. And when the Battle of Britain came, that wing would prove itself not only ingenious, but decisive. To understand why the Spitfire's wing was so revolutionary, you have to picture aviation in the early 1930s. Most fighters still carried thick, rectangular wings with abrupt edges and blunt tips, designs inherited from biplanes. They generated enough lift, sure, but they produced enormous drag. And in air combat, drag is the enemy. Drag slows turns. Drag wastes precious seconds in a climb. Drag kills energy, energy that a pilot needs to survive. Mitchell understood this intimately. Before designing fighters, he'd built racing seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy. These were aircraft that didn't just fly, they sliced through air like knives. And when the Supermarine S6B won the trophy in 1931, smashing records with its refined, streamlined surfaces, Mitchell learned a lesson that would shape his masterpiece. If you want to win in the sky, you must conquer the air itself. You must cut its resistance. You must tame it. So when the Air Ministry asked for a new modern fighter, Mitchell didn't look at biplanes for inspiration. He looked at mathematics, at aerodynamic theory, at the research emerging from German, British, and American wind tunnels. And he realized that the most efficient shape possible for a wing was the ellipse, because an elliptical planform produces the lowest possible induced drag for a given wingspan. In layman's terms, it wastes no energy. It turns all of its lift into useful lift. Nothing extra, nothing sloppy. Clean, pure, efficient. But the theory was the easy part. Building it, that was something else entirely. The Spitfire's elliptical wing was thin, far thinner than engineers were comfortable with. Thin wings resist air beautifully, but they're notoriously difficult to build because they must also house guns, ammunition boxes, control linkages, and landing gear. Mitchell's team had to carve out every millimeter of interior space just to fit 8 Browning 303 machine guns. They staggered them. They angled them. They designed unique access panels so armorers could reach the ammunition belts. It was like packing a violin with the internals of a machine shop. Precision, patience, and sheer stubborn ingenuity. Even the skin of the wing was special. Instead of fabric or simple sheet metal, the Spitfire used flush-riveted, stressed skin aluminum alloy, smooth as glass, so smooth that ground crews called it the wing that slips through your fingers. The smoothness cut drag even further, letting the Spitfire retain speed in prolonged turns where older aircraft would bleed energy and stall. And that, right there, is the heart of the Spitfire's legend. In hard turns, steep climbs, and evasive loops, the Spitfire simply held on. It kept its lift. It kept its energy. It kept fighting. By 1938, test pilots began to understand what Mitchell had created. Jeffrey Quill, one of the key test flyers, described the aircraft as completely natural in the air. Another pilot said it flew as if it were alive. The elliptical wing didn't just reduce drag, it made the controls harmonize. Ailerons, elevators, and rudder responded with almost intuitive precision. You moved the stick, and the aircraft seemed to anticipate your thought. The Spitfire didn't fight you, it invited you. But outside the cockpit, critics remained skeptical. The wing was expensive to produce. It required highly skilled metalworkers and precise tooling. Early production was notoriously slow. The Hurricane, its soon-to-be partner in the Battle of Britain, rolled off assembly lines far more quickly, with its simple rectangular wings and fabric-covered sections. Many RAF planners argued that the Spitfire's wing was unnecessary luxury. Too elegant, too complicated. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. The Luftwaffe proved itself brutally modern, and Britain found itself on the precipice of war with an air force dominated by the fast, deadly Bf-109E, an aircraft that could outclimb and outgun most Allied fighters. Air combat would be unforgiving. Only the best machines and the best designs would keep pilots alive. And as RAF squadrons equipped with Hurricanes and early Spitfires began testing themselves in drills, workshops, and mock engagements, pilots noticed something remarkable. In climbing turns, the Spitfire held speed longer. In tight horizontal turns, the Bf-109 struggled to stay on target. In vertical maneuvers where energy management was life or death, the Spitfire recovered faster. Again and again, the same truth emerged. Mitchell's thin elliptical wing wasn't just a design choice, it was a weapon. When the Battle of Britain erupted in the summer of 1940, that weapon showed its worth. Luftwaffe pilots reported how frustratingly agile the Spitfire was. The Bf-109 had better acceleration in a dive and faster straight-line speed at some altitudes, but it couldn't match the Spitfire's tight turning radius or gentle stall characteristics. One German pilot wrote that dogfighting with a Spitfire felt like chasing a swallow with an axe. At Duxford and Biggin Hill, Spitfire squadrons were rapidly thrown into the fiercest engagements of the war. And over the white cliffs of Dover, this new fighter, mocked, doubted, feared for its complicated wing, began carving its legend into the sky. Young pilots could whip the aircraft into turns that other fighters simply couldn't follow. They could slip out of danger with sudden banks that confused pursuing Germans. They could force opponents into high-drag maneuvers, bleeding away their airspeed until they stalled or were forced to disengage. And every bit of that capability stemmed from the elliptical wing's low drag and ideal lift distribution. But the wing's genius didn't stop with maneuverability. Its structure was strong enough to handle high G-forces without deforming. Its thin cross-section reduced compressibility effects as speeds increased, which would later become crucial as Spitfire variants pushed the boundaries of high-altitude and near-Mach flight. As the war evolved, so did the Spitfire. More powerful engines, heavier armament, clipped wings for roll rate, extended wings for altitude interception. But no matter the variant, the soul of the machine, the essence of its flight, always came back to that elegant shape first sketched on Mitchell's drawing board. And here's the tragedy. Mitchell never lived to see his masterpiece defend Britain. He died in 1937 from cancer, just months after the prototype's maiden flight. But his legacy soared on. In combat, pilots routinely returned with stories that bordered on the impossible. Tales of last-second evasions, of outturning opponents who thought they had the advantage, of making impossible climbs to intercept incoming bombers. The Spitfire wasn't just a tool, it became a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of the idea that British aviation, though small in number, could meet the industrial might of Nazi Germany head-on. As more squadrons re-equipped with Spitfires, Luftwaffe intelligence reported increasing concerns. German pilots began recommending new tactics: avoid turning fights at all costs, attack from above, strike hard, then disengage. But even these adapted strategies were hindered by the Spitfire's ability to retain energy in banking climbs. Pilots called it hanging on the prop, because even at near stalling speeds, the wing maintained just enough lift and control to keep the aircraft pointed exactly where the pilot wanted it. To other aviators around the world, this seemed like sorcery. To aerodynamicists, it was mathematics. Pure, efficient, beautiful mathematics expressed in aluminum alloy and curved spars. And as the war progressed, the Spitfire's elliptical wing continued to shape history far beyond 1940. In Malta, Spitfires with the same basic wing fought against overwhelming odds, diving into swarms of Axis fighters with unmatched control. In North Africa, they battled over scorching desert skies. In Europe, late-war variants used the wing's structural strength to mount cannons and rockets. Even as jet aircraft began to replace piston fighters, the aerodynamic lessons learned from Mitchell's design informed the next generation of airframes. When the war ended in 1945, the Spitfire was more than a fighter plane. It was a national icon, a symbol of engineering brilliance. And at the center of it all, unchanged in silhouette from the earliest prototypes, was that elliptical wing. But the story doesn't end here, because to truly understand the Spitfire's impact, you need to see how the wing influenced air combat psychology, RAF training doctrine, pilot survivability, and even post-war aircraft design philosophies. You need to follow the pilots who mastered it, the engineers who struggled to build it, and the Axis aviators who fought against it. You need to see how a single aerodynamic choice became one of the greatest advantages any Air Force possessed in the early years of World War II. Because the Spitfire's elliptical wing didn't just change aerodynamics, it changed the way pilots thought. During the Battle of Britain, RAF instructors quickly noticed that rookies transitioning into Spitfires adapted faster than expected. The aircraft felt intuitive, its stall behavior was forgiving, and its roll response, especially with the full-span elliptical shape, allowed a beginner to execute maneuvers that normally required months of experience. The wing was doing part of the thinking for them. This mattered enormously. In 1940, Britain was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Flight schools cut corners, rushed courses, and pushed half-prepared young men straight into squadrons. In any other fighter, this would have been catastrophic. But the Spitfire's wing softened the learning curve. It gave fledgling aviators a chance to survive their first missions, and that chance often meant everything. Pilots wrote in diaries how the Spitfire felt alive and alert, how it spoke through the controls, how it forgave the mistakes of the unseasoned. One RAF flyer, barely 19, recalled nearly stalling during a high G turn while chasing a 1-9. In a Hurricane or a Czech-built Avia, the wing would have snapped into a spin. But the Spitfire's smooth stall characteristics let him recover as if the aircraft were patiently correcting him. He landed that night trembling, whispering to his crew chief, "This thing just saved me." Even German aces took notice. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected commanders, famously said, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires," when asked what he needed to win the war. He wasn't praising British engines or British guns, he was praising the wing. He understood that in close combat, where reaction time, energy retention, and precise control ruled, the Spitfire held the advantage. But while pilots loved it, factories cursed it. Building an elliptical wing required complex curved spars and precision skinning that pushed the limits of 1930s manufacturing. Each wing required hours more labor than a comparable straight-edge design. Riveters needed special jigs, skinning crews needed new training. Toolmakers struggled to produce the forms and dies necessary for consistent curvature. It was so difficult that later, when the RAF looked to build a high-speed successor to the Spitfire, engineers insisted the new aircraft must have a simpler wing, not because elliptical was inferior, but because producing thousands of them during wartime was a logistical nightmare. Yet, despite these challenges, the results were undeniable. Over Dunkirk, over the Channel, over the rolling hills of England, the Spitfire could turn inside enemy fighters with breathtaking agility. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that if a Spitfire ever got onto their tail in a horizontal fight, escape was unlikely. The elliptical wing gave it that edge. But the story becomes even more fascinating when we move beyond the early war period, because the Spitfire's wing didn't just excel in tight-turn dogfights, it evolved. As more powerful engines were installed, Merlins first, then Griffins, the airframe needed to handle higher speeds, greater stresses, and new battlefield roles. Yet the elliptical wing kept proving adaptable. Early on, designers worried that compressibility effects, the strange and dangerous aerodynamic behavior near the speed of sound, might render the wing obsolete. But to their relief, the thin cross-section actually made the Spitfire more resilient in high-speed dives than many of its contemporaries. While Thunderbolts and Mustangs had superior dive characteristics at extreme speeds, the Spitfire's wing allowed it to retain controllability deep into the high subsonic range. This proved essential during intercept missions against high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and V-1 flying bombs. The Spitfire 14, with its Griffin engine and boosted performance, became one of the few Allied piston fighters capable of reliably intercepting fast-moving V-1s. Pilots would dive at incredible speeds, close the distance, and fire bursts that demanded supreme stability. Once again, the wing delivered. Even more impressive was how the wing adapted to different roles across diverse theaters. In Malta, under scorching Mediterranean sunlight, Spitfire pilots battled relentless Axis raids. The thin elliptical wing allowed them to climb rapidly to meet incoming bombers, then twist and maneuver in swirling dogfights above the island's battered defenses. Many Maltese Spitfire pilots described how the aircraft felt like the only thing standing between the island and destruction. In North Africa, the Spitfire contended with sand, heat, and hostile winds that challenged every aircraft. Yet the wing's efficient lift allowed fighters to scramble quickly from rough, makeshift runways and take on German and Italian aircraft at low altitudes where turbulence could be brutal. Even in these harsh conditions, the Spitfire's behavior remained steady and responsive. In Burma and India, where monsoon storms and jungle humidity warped wood and clogged filters, metal-winged Spitfires proved durable and dependable. The elliptical wing dealt gracefully with the harsh, hot, saturated air that plagued many aircraft. It kept the aircraft steady in tight, violent turns over dense jungle valleys, giving Allied pilots a fighting chance against Japanese aircraft known for their own exceptional maneuverability. But perhaps the most striking impact of the Spitfire's wing wasn't physical, it was psychological. To RAF pilots, the Spitfire wasn't just a fighter, it was reassurance. Every time they walked across a dispersal pad and saw those wings, those graceful sweeping curves, they felt a confidence that few other aircraft could inspire. One pilot said, "When you saw that shape, you felt you had a chance. When you climbed into the cockpit, you knew you had a chance." To German pilots, the silhouette of the Spitfire became a symbol of British resistance. Many reported that when they recognized an elliptical winged fighter diving toward them, they immediately switched to defensive tactics. Some Luftwaffe veterans admitted they preferred facing hurricanes, even when the Spitfire was rarer, simply because the hurricane was more predictable. Against the Spitfire, every maneuver risked being countered by a sudden, unexpected twist of that remarkable wing. To British civilians, the Spitfire became an icon of hope. Children pointed to the skies and recognized its outline instantly. Newspapers praised it. Posters featured it. When Churchill spoke of the few, the Spitfire's wing was burned into the collective imagination of a nation fighting for survival. As the war dragged on, engineers experimented with modifications to the wing. Some variants featured clipped wingtips, which improved roll rate and low-altitude performance by reducing wing area. These versions looked almost brutish compared to the original elegant shape, but they could roll faster, a valuable asset during ground attack missions or when fighting agile, low-altitude foes. Yet even in these modified forms, the essential aerodynamics of the elliptical route remained intact. Other variants added extended wingtips for high-altitude missions. These pointed-wing Spitfires could climb to extraordinary heights, intercepting German spy planes and later Japanese high-altitude bombers. Again, the wing proved adaptable, showing versatility far beyond what Mitchell had originally imagined. By 1945, the Spitfire had evolved into multiple marks, each with more power, more speed, more firepower, but all sharing the same DNA, the wing that made everything possible. And after the war, when jets began to claim the skies, the lessons of that wing didn't disappear. Engineers studying early jet aircraft retained the principle that smooth lift distribution and careful drag management were essential for agility. The elliptical planform itself was rarely used again. It was too difficult and too expensive to manufacture in peacetime. But the philosophy behind it continued. The Spitfire's wing taught the world that performance isn't just about power. Maneuverability isn't just about weight. Victory isn't just about numbers. Sometimes it's about elegance, precision, understanding the invisible forces of air and shaping your aircraft to dance with them. In 1946, as Spitfires flew their final wartime patrols, surviving pilots wrote farewell letters to their machines. One simply read, "You were more than my aircraft. You were my guardian." Another said, "You carried me through things I could not have survived alone." Even decades later, when restored Spitfires lift gently from grass runways during air shows, the crowd falls silent as the wings catch the light. Those curves, that silhouette, it stirs something deep. Not just nostalgia, but respect, awe. Recognition that this shape once stood between freedom and tyranny. The elliptical wing remains one of the greatest aerodynamic achievements of the 20th century. It combined theoretical perfection with engineering brilliance. It gave pilots an advantage when they needed it most. It endured across multiple theaters, climates, and combat roles, and it left behind a legacy of both beauty and deadly effectiveness. When historians discuss the reasons the RAF won the Battle of Britain, many factors come into play. Radar, ground control, logistics, pilot courage, and industrial resilience. But ask the pilots themselves, and many will quietly mention another factor: the Spitfire's wing. The way it moved, the way it responded, the way it kept them alive. Reginald Mitchell didn't live to see what his creation accomplished, but his design, drawn from mathematics, instinct, and a deep understanding of air, became a symbol of hope that outlived him, a symbol that still flies today. And every time a Spitfire banks overhead, you can see exactly why. The wing doesn't just cut through the air, it sings through it, and its song is one of freedom.